Daniel Hayes thought tonight would be simple, just a quiet dinner, maybe a chance to step outside the circle of routine that defined most of his life as a single father. At 34, he had learned how to keep things in order. The warehouse he managed, the small home he kept tidy in Denver, the steady rhythm of raising his 8-year-old son, Ethan. The house smelled faintly of disinfectant from his third swipe at the glass door, the kind of nervous cleaning that came when hope brushed against fear. Ethan sat on the couch, one sock striped, the other plain, holding a flashlight like it was a magic wand. "Dad, what if she's a robot? You met her online," he whispered with wide-eyed seriousness. Daniel chuckled, straightened his collar as if that could steady his heart. "Then I'll just reprogram her to like tacos," he said. They both laughed softly, the sound filling the small living room. Then the doorbell rang. Daniel opened the door and froze. Sophie Miller stood under the porch light, her chestnut hair brushing her shoulders, her green eyes filled with a hesitation that said more than words ever could. She pulled her jacket tighter, her voice barely above a whisper. "My kids are in the car. They haven't eaten." It wasn't just what she said, it was how she carried it. Shame lingered in the pauses between her syllables, as though she'd had to explain her life too many times to people who only ever judged. Daniel's throat tightened, not with doubt, but with recognition. He knew that look, that tone, that hidden fear of being seen as less. He had warned himself years ago when he was left alone to raise his son. Without hesitation, he stepped aside, his voice calm, steady. "Bring them in. Tacos. Don't judge." For a moment, she seemed uncertain, as though kindness was something foreign. Then she gave a small nod. Moments later, 2 children entered quietly. A boy and a girl, no older than 10. The girl clutched a worn stuffed rabbit, its fur thinned from years of holding on too tight. The boy's eyes were tired but curious, darting toward Ethan, who waved him over with the confidence only children carry. Daniel moved quickly, setting plates on the table, letting the scent of warm tortillas and seasoned meat replace the silence. Sophie sat at the edge of the chair, her posture stiff, as though she feared overstaying. But Daniel knew the silence didn't need to be heavy. He remembered too well what it felt like to walk into a room and pray you didn't look too hungry, too exhausted, too fragile. He glanced at her, offering a small, reassuring smile. She looked up, startled, like someone who hadn't been truly seen in a long time. And in that quiet moment, Daniel realized this night was not just about a date. It was about something far more important, the chance to give 3 strangers a seat at his table, and maybe the beginning of a story none of them expected. The table felt smaller with 4 plates instead of 2. The quiet clinking of forks filled the spaces between breaths. Ethan leaned in to tell Sophie's son about his favorite video game, their voices soon blending into a rhythm of boyish laughter. The little girl sat pressed against her mother, nibbling on a tortilla, still holding her worn rabbit. Daniel watched all of it with a kind of tenderness he didn't expect to feel that night. The sight of children finding comfort faster than the adults who carried their weight. He turned his attention to Sophie. She sat with careful posture, shoulders drawn slightly inward, her eyes darting from the food to the children, as though waiting for someone to remind her this was all too much. Daniel understood that look. It was the same one that used to live on his face. He set his fork down, leaned his arms gently on the table, and spoke in a voice steady enough to carry truth without pity. "I was a single parent at 26, he said, quietly, watching her lift her eyes in surprise. "My wife left, emptied our account, and for a while I thought I wouldn't make it through. There's this walk you do when you're exhausted and hungry, but you try not to show it, because if people notice, they make assumptions you can't fight." He paused, his gaze softening. "I know that walk, Sophie. I know it better than I'd like." Her eyes glistened, a sharp breath catching in her chest. For a moment she said nothing, only studied him as if trying to measure whether he truly understood. Then with the faintest shake of her head, she whispered, "No one's ever said that to me before." Her voice trembled, not because she was weak, but because she'd been unseen for too long. The kids were already deep in their own world. Ethan showing off his Lego tower, while Sophie's son added pieces with careful precision. Laughter echoed down the hallway. Sophie looked toward them and then back at Daniel, her lips curving in the smallest of smiles, one that seemed to lift the heaviness off her shoulders, if only for a second. Dinner stretched longer than either of them planned, not because of the food, but because silence no longer felt dangerous. It felt safe. When the plates were cleared and the children curled up on the couch watching cartoons, Sophie lingered at the edge of the room, her hands folded in her lap, eyes downcast. Daniel noticed the way she chewed her lip, gathering courage for something she needed to say. Finally, she whispered, "I almost didn't come. I was going to cancel, turn the car around before I ever got here, but something told me not to." She lifted her gaze, vulnerable and steady at once. "I don't know why." Daniel leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth softening into a smile that wasn't rushed or forced. "Good," he said simply, "because I think tonight was meant to be." The words landed gently but carried a weight neither of them could ignore. Sophie's eyes lingered on him, a flicker of disbelief wrestling with hope. In that quiet space, with children's laughter weaving through the walls, the air between them shifted. What had begun as a hesitant dinner now felt like the start of something unexpected. Not a coincidence, not an accident, but a meeting that carried the shape of destiny. The evening had softened into something almost tender. The kids curled into blankets on the couch, their laughter fading into the steady hum of cartoons. Sophie sat a little closer now, her posture less guarded. Daniel thought maybe, just maybe, the night would end with a sense of calm, but peace has a fragile way of trembling before it breaks. Through the front window, just beyond the glow of the porch light, a shadow lingered. Parked 3 houses down, a black sedan with tinted windows idled in silence. Daniel hadn't noticed at first, too caught up in the small miracle of connection at his table. It was Sophie who saw it, her eyes flicking toward the glass twice in the span of a minute, her fingers tightening around her sleeve as if the fabric might shield her from what she feared. Daniel followed her gaze, his instincts, honed from years of raising Ethan alone, sharpening instantly. He lowered his voice so the children wouldn't hear. "Sophie," he said gently, "is someone following you?" Her breath hitched. She tried to answer, but words snagged in her throat. Finally, she leaned closer, her whisper carrying the weight of a secret she'd been forced to live with. "I don't know for sure, but I think it's him. Logan Pierce," she. The name carried a chill. She didn't need to explain further, but she did, her voice trembling in the quiet. "He doesn't want custody, Daniel. He wants control. He checks the GPS on my car, calls if I drive somewhere he doesn't approve. He's already moved on to his 3rd girlfriend this year, but somehow I'm still the one he wants to punish." Daniel's jaw tightened, his chest heavy as he looked toward the living room where the kids giggled over a cartoon character. In that instant, something shifted. This wasn't dinner. This wasn't a date. This was a rescue. He placed a steady hand over hers, grounding her trembling fingers. "You're safe here tonight. I won't let you walk back into that." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a promise. Sophie blinked rapidly, her lips parting as if to protest. "Why are you being kind to someone you barely know?" The question cracked in the air, filled with disbelief born of too many disappointments. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because someone once showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it either, and it saved me." He didn't tell her the whole story, that a neighbor had offered him work when he had nothing left, when his wife had vanished and his world had fallen apart. But the truth of it lived in his voice, and she heard it. Outside, the sedan's engine turned over, headlights briefly flashing across the street before it slipped away into the night. But Daniel knew better than to believe it was gone for good. Men like Logan didn't just disappear. They circled, waiting for weakness. Sophie's shoulders sagged with exhaustion, yet her eyes held a flicker of something else now. Relief, maybe even trust. Daniel rose quietly and led her down the hall where the guest room waited. "Stay here," he said softly. "Let the kids sleep. You don't have to fight this alone anymore." She nodded, tears brimming, though she tried to hold them back. And for the first time in a long while, she let herself believe him. The house settled into a hush after the children drifted to sleep, their small bodies tangled in blankets, their breathing soft and even. Sophie stood in the hallway, uncertain, her hands clasped together as though bracing for the moment she would be told to leave. Daniel leaned against the doorframe of the guest room, his expression calm, but his words carried a quiet finality. You and the kids can stay here. I'm not letting you go back out there tonight. Her lips parted as if to argue, but the fight left her almost as quickly as it rose. The weight she carried was not just fear, it was the exhaustion of always running, always apologizing, always looking over her shoulder. Daniel, she whispered, her voice frayed. I don't want to be a burden. You're not, he replied gently, meeting her eyes with steady certainty. This house is small, but it's safe, and sometimes safe is all anyone really needs. Something in her posture softened. For the first time, she didn't stand like a woman waiting for the ground to fall away. She sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumped, but not from defeat, rather from release, as though she had permission to set down the armor she'd been carrying for years. While Sophie tucked her daughter in, her son sat cross-legged on the floor with a handful of crayons scavenged from Ethan's toy box. His small brow furrowed in concentration, his tongue pressed against his lip, the way children do when their world narrows to one important task. Daniel crouched beside him, watching as color filled the page. Slowly, the picture took shape. 4 stick figures standing side by side, hands linked. One had spiky brown hair, clearly meant to be him. Above them, the boy scrawled 2 words in uneven letters, New Family. When Sophie saw it, her breath caught. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening, but no sob came, only a trembling silence that said more than words. She knelt beside her son, brushing his hair back gently. It's beautiful, she whispered, her voice breaking on the last syllable. Daniel glanced at her, but didn't speak. Instead, he reached out and rested a hand lightly on her shoulder, steady and respectful, giving her something to hold on to without taking away her dignity. She closed her eyes, allowing herself that brief anchor, the kind she hadn't trusted in years. Later, when the lights dimmed and the house settled, Daniel sat at the kitchen table alone. He thought of the neighbor who once gave him work when he was on the edge of losing everything, a man who told him, "You've got a son. That means you've got a reason to fight." He understood in his bones how that one act of kindness had rippled forward, bringing him here to this moment, to these strangers who no longer felt like strangers at all. Upstairs, Sophie wiped tears quietly before lying down, her children tucked safely at her side, and for the first time in years, she let herself breathe deeply without fearing what tomorrow might bring. That night, she slept not as a woman on the run, but as a mother who had finally found, if only for a moment, the shelter of trust. The house in Denver felt almost like it belonged to them all. The children moved through the narrow hallways as though they'd lived there forever, laughter bouncing off the walls while Sophie slowly allowed herself to believe in the possibility of peace. Daniel carried that hope quietly, careful not to press, careful only to hold the fragile balance they'd built. But peace never stays untested for long. A knock came, not the polite kind you expect from a neighbor, but the heavy, deliberate pounding of someone who believed the world owed him obedience. Daniel wiped his hands on a dish towel and opened the door. Standing there was a man in his late 30s, leather jacket gleaming, sunglasses reflecting the porch light, though the sky was still gray with dawn. "Logan Pierce," he said, as if an introduction were unnecessary. "I'm here for my kids." Daniel didn't move from the doorway, his voice steady, even. "They're not yours to take." Behind him, Sophie froze at the end of the hallway, her hands clutching the fabric of her sweater, but she forced herself forward, standing just behind Daniel's shoulder. Her voice trembled, but her words carried the weight of truth. "You haven't seen them in 5 months, Logan. You missed the hearing. The court said visitation starts next week." Logan's jaw flexed, irritation flickering beneath his calm facade. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "I'll be back with paperwork. This place," he glanced around with disdain. "Small house, cheap car, some sad loner playing hero. You think this is where my kids belong?" His eyes slid to Sophie, sharp and cruel. "Pathetic." Daniel didn't flinch. He met Logan's stare, the air between them charged, and answered with a voice as firm as stone, "Get off my porch." For a long moment, the 2 men stood locked in silence, one fueled by arrogance, the other by resolve. Then Logan's smirk returned, thinner this time, edged with threat. "Enjoy the show while it lasts, man. You don't know who you're messing with." He turned sharply, the sound of his boots striking the walkway like punctuation marks to his promise. The black sedan roared to life and disappeared down the street, leaving only exhaust and unease behind. Inside, Sophie collapsed onto the couch, her hands trembling so hard she could barely hold the coffee Daniel set in front of her. Her breath came shallow, words slipping out like a confession. He won't stop. He never stops. I used to think maybe I was crazy, that it was just me. Daniel sat beside her, not too close, but close enough. His voice was quiet, unshaken. You're not crazy, Sophie. He's the chaos. You're the one surviving it. She looked at him then, eyes wide, vulnerable. You don't owe me anything. I walked in here on a date, and now I'm asking you to risk everything. Daniel leaned forward, his gaze steady, unwavering. This stopped being about a date the second you whispered, "My kids are in the car." For the first time, she let the words sink in, tears filling her eyes, not with fear, but with the faint glimmer of being believed. And in that fragile silence, Daniel knew the fight ahead was no longer hers alone. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the peace they'd grown used to. It was the heavy silence that follows a storm, the kind where every creak of the floorboards feels like a warning. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea, eyes fixed on a point far beyond the room. Daniel noticed the way her shoulders curled in, the way she seemed to fold into herself as though bracing for a truth she could no longer carry alone. He set his phone down, pulled out a chair, and sat across from her. "Talk to me," he said gently. "Whatever it is, I can't help if I don't know." Her lips trembled as she opened them, then closed again, the war between fear and desperation flashing in her eyes. Finally, she reached into her bag and slid something small across the table. A silver USB drive, scuffed at the edges, resting between them like a confession. Her voice was barely audible. "This has everything. Bank transfers, accounts, names. Logan used my identity for loans, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt that were never mine. His family has connections in real estate, money tied up in places you can't imagine. And every time I tried to fight back, there was someone waiting to shut the door. A police officer who plays poker with him every Friday. Collectors who lost the paperwork when I asked for proof. It's all there." Daniel stared at the drive, anger tightening in his chest. He wanted to believe the system could protect her, but he knew better. He'd seen men like Logan, men who thrived on bending rules until people broke. He lifted his eyes to Sophie's, saw the fear trembling just beneath the surface, but also the spark of defiance she had tried so long to bury. "Why give this to me?" he asked softly. "Because I can't run forever," she whispered, tears sliding unchecked down her cheeks. "And because when you told him to get off your porch, I believed you. For the first time in years, I believed someone might actually stay." Daniel reached out, covering the small device with his hand, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he spoke, his voice firm, steady, carrying the weight of a decision already made. "We're not running anymore. Not you, not the kids. If he thinks fear is his leash, then it breaks here." Sophie blinked, startled by the certainty in his tone. "Daniel, you don't understand who he is, what he can do." "No," he interrupted gently. "I understand exactly. I've lost everything before, Sophie. I know what it costs, but I also know what it's like to fight when you have a reason. You and those kids, you're worth the fight." The words hung between them, heavy and unshakable. Sophie pressed her hands to her face, a sob catching in her throat, not from despair this time, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of being believed. Daniel leaned back, the flash drive now in his pocket, as though it had always belonged there. Outside, the street was empty, no sedan in sight, but the threat still lingered in the night air. He didn't fool himself into thinking the battle would be easy, but for the first time since Sophie appeared on his porch, Daniel felt something stronger than fear settling in his chest. Resolve. And in that moment, he knew they would not hide, they would stand. Daniel stepped out to take the trash to the curb. The air in Denver carried the bite of early spring, crisp enough to sting his lungs. As he walked past Sophie's car, parked along the street, something caught his eye, a faint glint under the rear bumper, small and deliberate. His stomach tightened. Instinct told him before reason did. He crouched, reaching under the frame until his fingers brushed against cold metal. It was no bigger than a pack of matches, sealed tight with a magnetic casing, a GPS tracker. He pulled it free, holding it in the porch light, the tiny device humming with the unspoken truth. Logan hadn't just been watching from a distance. He had been inside their every move. By the time Daniel returned to the house, his chest felt like it was carrying both fire and stone. He waited until the kids were asleep before making the call. Caleb Foster, an old friend from his systems engineering days, now worked in cybercrime analysis. Daniel hadn't asked him for a favor in years, but tonight, he didn't hesitate. "Send me what you've got," Caleb said after a long pause. "I'll dig." While Sophie sat quietly sketching with her daughter in the living room, Daniel's phone buzzed. Caleb's voice came low, urgent. "It's not random, Daniel. The tracker's registered to a shell company. The name looks clean, but funding traces back to a Pierce family trust. Your guy didn't even bother to cover his tracks. Well, he thinks he's untouchable." Daniel thanked him, slid the phone back into his pocket, and stepped out onto the porch. The night was still, a single street lamp buzzing overhead. Sophie followed a moment later, wrapping his hoodie tighter around her shoulders. Her face was pale in the glow, her eyes searching his. "You found something, didn't you?" He opened his hand, showing her the small black device. Her breath caught, her hand flying to her mouth. "He's escalating," she whispered. "This is what he does when he feels like he's losing." Daniel turned the tracker over in his palm, then met her gaze. "Then we make him lose more." He leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "Peace doesn't show up on its own, Sophie. We fight for it. We guard it like treasure, and this time we don't let him take it from you." Her eyes welled, tears glinting, though she tried to blink them back. She shook her head slowly, disbelieving. "You could walk away. You could tell me this isn't your problem. Why stay?" Daniel's answer was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he'd endured. "Because I know what it's like to feel hunted, and I know what it's like to fight alone. I won't let you go through this without someone in your corner." The porch fell silent except for the faint hum of the streetlight. Sophie's shoulders trembled, but for the first time, it wasn't from fear. It was from the fragile hope that maybe, finally, she wasn't standing alone. She exhaled shakily, whispering a single word almost too soft to hear. "Thank you." Daniel slipped the tracker into his pocket, no longer a symbol of control, but of evidence. He looked out into the quiet street, knowing Logan would be back, knowing the fight was only beginning. But with Sophie at his side, with the children asleep safely upstairs, his resolve solidified into something unbreakable. Tonight, fear lost its hold. Tonight, the battle shifted. The morning air outside the elementary school was filled with the usual sounds: children laughing, backpacks unzipping, parents calling out quick reminders before the bell. For Sophie's kids, it should have been an ordinary day, but as Daniel's truck pulled to the curb, he saw the figure leaning casually against a sleek black car. Sunglasses, leather jacket, that same smirk he'd seen on his porch. Logan Pierce, or him. It was Sophie's daughter who noticed first, her small hand freezing on the door handle, her voice catching as she whispered, "Mom, he's here." Her fear sliced through the moment, erasing the normalcy of morning drop-off. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He stepped out before Sophie could speak, his boots striking the pavement with purpose. Logan looked up from his phone, pretending to scroll, as if his presence was nothing more than a coincidence. But Daniel knew better. "You touch me," Logan said coolly as Daniel approached, "and I'll have you arrested." Daniel didn't flinch, his voice low, firm enough to cut through the chaos of the schoolyard. "Go ahead, but before you do, maybe ask your family lawyer how those shell companies are holding up." Logan's smirk faltered just slightly. Daniel took another step closer, his eyes locked on the man who had spent months tightening chains around Sophie's life. "I know about the fake loans. I know about the GPS tracker under her car, and so does a friend at the DA's office. All of it's documented now. You want to play this game in court? Then get ready to lose for the first time." Logan's mask cracked, his jaw flexed, the charm slipping to reveal the edge beneath. You think you're a hero? He sneered, voice pitched low enough to keep the parents nearby from hearing. I'm not a hero, Daniel answered, steady as stone. I'm a father, and I'm not letting your control define their lives anymore. For a long moment, the two men stood locked in silence, a storm of tension swirling around them, while the ordinary world of children and laughter carried on just feet away. Then Logan broke it, pulling his sunglasses back into place, retreating with a final glare. This isn't over, he muttered. Daniel watched him slide behind the wheel of the black car, the engine roaring as Logan pulled away from the curb. He knew the words weren't empty. Men like Logan rarely left quietly. But for now, the children were safe. Sophie was safe. And that was enough. As Daniel walked back toward the truck, Sophie's eyes met his through the glass, wide with fear, but softened with something else. Trust. For the first time, she'd seen someone stand in the open for her, unflinching, refusing to bend. He climbed back in, started the engine, and drove toward the day ahead. But inside, he knew the confrontation was just a prelude. Logan had retreated, yes, yet the battle waiting in the courtroom would demand more than resolve. It would demand everything. The fight that had hovered in the shadows was dragged into the light of a courtroom. Sophie sat on a wooden bench outside the county courthouse in Denver, her navy blouse plain, her hair pulled back, her hands trembling, no matter how tightly she clasped them. Daniel sat beside her, his black blazer the same one he wore to Ethan's school meetings, but his posture carried a different weight today. This wasn't about grades or parent conferences. This was about survival. Logan had filed an emergency motion for full custody, pushing it through with the speed only money and influence could buy. Inside the courtroom, he sat in a crisp suit, flanked by two attorneys who wore their smirks like armor. He played his part well, the concerned father, the regretful ex, the man just trying to do right. But Daniel saw the arrogance beneath it, the same poison that had lingered in every threat, every smirk on Sophie's porch. When Sophie took the stand, her voice cracked under the sharp questions of Logan's lawyer. Words twisted against her, painted into a story where she was reckless, unstable, incapable of giving her children the safety they deserved. Daniel's fists clenched beneath the table, his jaw tight as he watched the woman who had fought so hard for her kids be cornered by the same lies she had been running from for years. Then it was his turn. Daniel walked to the stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore his oath. He looked straight at Logan, not flinching, not looking away. His voice was calm, steady, but each word cut with truth. I've known Sophie for a month. That's not long. But I've known fear for years. I know the look in a child's eyes when they don't feel safe. I know what it is when they finally sleep through the night because they're not waiting for someone to explode. And that's what her children look like now. Safe. He turned toward the judge, his tone unwavering. This isn't about love triangles or broken marriages. This is about control. Logan Pierce has violated privacy, planted surveillance, and manipulated systems to keep power over Sophie, not to protect his children. From his pocket, Daniel slid a folder across the table. Inside were records Caleb had traced back to Logan. Ownership of the GPS tracker tied to a Pierce family trust, text messages laced with threats, and a therapist's report documenting the children's emotional trauma linked directly to their father's presence. The judge leaned forward, flipping through the volume, her expression unreadable. Logan's face, however, betrayed the first flicker of panic, his confident mask cracking under the weight of evidence too sharp to dismiss. The courtroom fell into silence so heavy it felt like thunder had rolled through. Then, after deliberation, the gavel struck. The words were clear: final temporary custody granted to the mother, a full restraining order issued, an investigation into Logan Pierce's conduct formally opened. Sophie broke down the moment they stepped outside, sobbing into Daniel's chest, sound raw and unguarded. Her children clung to her waist, their small arms wrapped tight around her as though they could hold her steady. Daniel folded them all into his embrace, his own eyes burning, though he refused to let the tears fall. The battle wasn't over, but in that moment, they had won something precious: safety, dignity, and the first fragile step toward freedom. The rhythm of life began to feel different, lighter, steadier, as though the walls of Daniel's small house in Denver had learned how to hold joy instead of fear. Sophie had started a new job at a design firm downtown, her confidence slowly rebuilding piece by piece. The children, once restless and anxious, now slept soundly through the night and woke with laughter on their lips. Even Ethan seemed transformed, his home now alive with more than just the sound of his own footsteps. On one quiet evening, the backyard carried the scent of marshmallows roasting over a small fire pit. The kids' laughter rose and fell like music, drifting through the air before fading into yawns and sleepy eyes. Sophie tucked them in, kissed their foreheads, and returned to the porch where Daniel waited. The light above the door cast a warm circle around them, the hum of the city softened by distance. She leaned against the railing, her voice almost a whisper. "Do you remember that night I showed up and said, 'My kids are in the car'?" Her words lingered, fragile but steady, carrying the echo of a beginning that already felt like a lifetime ago. Daniel looked at her, his eyes reflecting the porch light, a smile curving gently at the corner of his mouth. "You look terrified," he said softly, "but your eyes, they weren't begging. They were asking for a chance." Sophie let out a shaky laugh, brushing a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. "And you gave us more than a chance, Daniel. You gave us a home." Her voice caught on the last word, heavy with gratitude, but also something deeper, something that felt like hope reborn. He took a step closer, his presence steady, grounding. "Then stay," he murmured, "not as a guest, not as someone waiting for the storm to pass. Stay, because this," he gestured toward the quiet house where children now dreamed in peace, "this feels like it was always meant to be." For a moment she only looked at him, her green eyes shimmering with the reflection of everything they had survived. Then, without hesitation, she closed the space between them. Daniel met her halfway, his hand brushing gently against her cheek, before their lips touched under the porch light. It wasn't a kiss of urgency or escape. It was one of quiet certainty, of promises unspoken, but understood. In that moment there was no fear, no shadow of the man who had haunted her steps. Only warmth, only peace. When they finally drew apart, Sophie rested her forehead against his chest, her voice barely audible. "We're a family now, aren't we?" Daniel's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close. "We've been one since the night you knocked on my door," he whispered. Above them, the porch light flickered gently, casting its glow over a scene that once seemed impossible. A mother, a father, and children sleeping soundly inside. Not perfect, not untouched by scars, but whole in a way that mattered most. In a quiet Denver home, Daniel Hayes opened his door for a blind date, expecting a simple evening. But Sophie Miller's trembling words, "My kids are in the car. They haven't eaten," shifted his world. A single father who knew the weight of struggle, Daniel welcomed her children without hesitation, offering tacos and a safe space. As Sophie's past, shadowed by her controlling ex, Logan Pierce, emerged, Daniel stood firm, confronting threats and uncovering evidence to protect her family. Their journey from a hesitant dinner to a courtroom victory forged a bond not of chance, but of choice, a family built on trust and courage. This story unveils a profound lesson. True strength lies in choosing to stand by someone in their darkest moments, offering safety without judgment. Daniel's unwavering support and Sophie's bravery in sharing her truth teach us that family is not defined by blood, but by those who choose to fight for you when fear looms large. In a world quick to judge, their story reminds us that kindness, whether a shared meal or a defiant stand, can break chains of control and build homes where love thrives. Their kiss under the porch light, with children sleeping soundly, proves that hope can rise from vulnerability when we dare to believe in each other. If this story stirred your soul,